Hello and welcome to Stories Before Sleep. It's late, and the night feels heavier than usual. Maybe you've had one of those days, too many questions, not enough answers. Before sleep pulls you away, I want to tell you something gentle, something almost forgotten. There was once a man named Laozi, not the mystical figure people quote on social media, not the sage wrapped in clouds of legend. No, a real man, quiet, observant, someone who felt the weight of the world and chose to step back rather than push forward. His story isn't loud. It doesn't demand your attention. But tonight, in this stillness, it might just speak to you in a way it never has before. Let me take you to the moment where his journey truly began. Most of us are taught that the path to peace comes from doing more, work harder, achieve more, climb higher, become stronger. We're told that success comes from effort, from pushing, from fighting our way to the top. And maybe that works for some people. But what if it doesn't? What if there's another way? That's what Laozi discovered. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. Not as a lecture, not as some ancient philosophy that doesn't matter anymore, but as a story. A real story about a real man who lived over 2,000 years ago, who looked at the world around him and asked a simple question. What if we're doing this all wrong? His answer changed everything, not just for him, but for millions of people across centuries. And maybe it can change something for you too. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the man who taught the world that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Imagine a man sitting in a vast library. Not the kind you see today with fluorescent lights and computers. This was different. Rows upon rows of bamboo strips, each one carefully inscribed with characters organized in wooden cases that stretched from floor to ceiling. The air smelled of ink and age. Dust particles floated through shafts of light coming from high windows. This was the imperial archive during the late Zhou dynasty, sometime around the 6th century before the Common Era. And the man sitting there carefully cataloging these records was Laozi. He wasn't famous yet. He wouldn't be famous for quite some time. In fact, most people in the capital city didn't know his name at all. He was simply the keeper of records, the archivist, the man who knew where everything was filed, who understood the organization of knowledge itself. It wasn't a glamorous position. It wasn't the kind of job that made people notice you at court gatherings. But it was perfect for someone like him. You see, the Zhou dynasty was crumbling. Not all at once, like a building collapsing. It happened slowly, the way empires usually fall. The central authority that had held everything together for centuries began to fragment. Regional lords grew more powerful. They stopped listening to the emperor. They started making their own decisions, raising their own armies, pursuing their own ambitions. The kingdom that had once felt unified now felt like it was tearing itself apart at the seams. In the capital, there was constant activity. Scholars debated philosophy in the streets. Politicians maneuvered for power. Ambitious young men came seeking positions in government, hoping to make their mark on history. Everyone wanted something. Everyone was pushing toward something. The energy was frenetic, almost desperate. People believed that if they just worked hard enough, studied hard enough, positioned themselves correctly, they could fix what was broken. They could restore order. They could become important. But Laozi watched all of this from his quiet archive. He observed the endless stream of visitors coming to consult the records. He saw how they searched for precedent, for historical examples that might justify their current ambitions. He noticed how they twisted the past to serve the present, how they used history not to understand truth, but to win arguments. Day after day, he organized these records. Day after day, he saw the same patterns repeat themselves. He thought, all this striving, all this effort to control and manipulate, and for what? The more people try to fix things, the more broken everything becomes. This wasn't cynicism exactly. It was observation. Laozi had spent enough time with history to understand something fundamental about human nature. The harder people pushed, the more resistance they encountered. The more they tried to control outcomes, the more unpredictable things became. It was like trying to hold water in your fist. The tighter you squeezed, the more it escaped through your fingers. Around him, the city buzzed with activity. Confucius was teaching his students about proper conduct and social hierarchy. Other philosophers were developing their own systems of thought, their own answers to the chaos. Everyone had a solution. Everyone believed that if people just followed the right rules, studied the right texts, behaved the right way, everything would be restored to harmony. They believed in the power of effort, in the power of will, in the power of doing. But Laozi had come to believe something different. He believed that most of humanity's problems came from trying too hard, from imposing artificial order on something that wanted to flow naturally. He'd read enough of the history to know this. Empires that tried to control everything eventually collapsed under their own weight. Rulers who forced their will on their people eventually faced rebellion. Systems that became too rigid eventually shattered. What if he wondered the answer wasn't to do more? What if the answer was to do less? This thought wasn't fully formed yet. It wasn't a complete philosophy. It was more like a seed, a small question that kept growing in his mind as he worked among the archives. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't have a system worked out. He just knew that something felt wrong about the way everyone was approaching their problems. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, working in the very center of imperial power, surrounded by the machinery of government and ambition, and he was coming to believe that all of this striving was fundamentally misguided. He was beginning to understand that peace didn't come from achievement. Harmony didn't come from control. Truth didn't come from accumulating more knowledge or more power or more possessions. It came from something else entirely, something simpler, something that most people overlooked because it seemed too obvious, too ordinary, too empty. He continued his work. He organized the records. He answered the questions of those who came seeking information. He lived quietly without drawing attention to himself. But inside, something was shifting. A realization was taking root. And it would eventually change not just his life, but the course of human thought itself. One day, a visitor came to the archive. This wasn't unusual in itself. Scholars and officials frequently consulted the records. But this particular visitor carried a different kind of energy. He arrived with students trailing behind him, eager young men who hung on his every word. His name was Kongzi, though history would later know him by the Latinized version of his name, Confucius. He was already becoming famous throughout the kingdom for his teachings about proper conduct, social order, and moral cultivation. He came seeking historical precedent. He wanted to understand how the ancient sage kings had governed, how they'd maintained order, how they'd created harmony through virtue and proper ritual. He believed that if people could study these examples carefully enough, if they could understand the principles underlying good governance, they could restore the kingdom to its former glory. It was a reasonable belief. It made sense. And it was precisely the kind of thinking that filled the archive with visitors every single day. Laozi helped him find what he was looking for. He knew exactly where the records were stored. He pulled out the bamboo strips, showed the visitor the relevant passages, answered his questions with courtesy and precision. It was his job after all. But as he worked, something happened. A conversation began. Not just an exchange of information, but a genuine dialogue between two very different minds. The younger man spoke with conviction about the importance of ritual, of proper behavior, of studying the ancients to understand how to live correctly. He talked about the necessity of hierarchy of each person, knowing their place and fulfilling their role. He believed that society functioned like a well-ordered machine where every part had its function. And if everyone performed their function correctly, the whole system would work perfectly. It was elegant. It was logical. It was also, Laozi thought, fundamentally flawed. He listened carefully before responding. This was his nature. He didn't rush to argue or to prove his point. He simply listened. And then he spoke. What he said wasn't confrontational. It was more like a question posed gently, almost as an afterthought. He suggested that perhaps all this emphasis on ritual and proper behavior might actually be creating more problems than it solved. Perhaps, he offered, when society becomes so focused on rules and regulations, it's because something more fundamental has already been lost. The younger man looked puzzled. How could following proper conduct be a problem? How could studying the ancients lead people astray? Wasn't that exactly what was needed to restore order? Laozi explained his thinking. When people are naturally virtuous, they don't need rules to guide them. When a society is truly harmonious, ritual happens naturally, without anyone having to think about it. But when you have to constantly emphasize proper conduct, when you have to create elaborate systems of ritual and etiquette, it means that the natural virtue has already disappeared. You're trying to patch a hole in a dam that's already broken. You're treating the symptom instead of the disease. Furthermore, he continued, all this effort to control and regulate human behavior often produces the opposite of what's intended. The more rules you create, the more people find ways to break them. The more you emphasize proper conduct, the more people become conscious of their own impropriety. You end up with a society that's obsessed with appearances, where people follow the rules not because they understand their value, but because they fear punishment. That's not harmony. That's just a more sophisticated form of chaos. The younger man felt something shift inside him. He thought, this old keeper of records is saying something that challenges everything I've built my philosophy upon. But there's something in what he says that rings true, something I can't quite dismiss. Yet he also felt defensive. His entire system of thought was built on the opposite premise. If he accepted what this man was saying, he'd have to reconsider everything. He'd have to admit that his approach might be fundamentally misguided. So he pushed back. He argued that without rules and ritual, society would descend into chaos. Without proper conduct and hierarchy, how would anything function? Laozi didn't argue forcefully. He simply offered another perspective. He suggested that nature itself provided the best model for how things should work. Look at water, he said. Water doesn't follow rules, yet it flows perfectly. It finds its way around obstacles without struggling. It nourishes everything it touches without demanding anything in return. It's the softest thing in existence, yet it can wear away the hardest stone. There's a lesson in that, he suggested. A lesson about how to live. The conversation continued for hours. The younger man's students listened intently, trying to understand this exchange between two very different philosophies. One believed in structure, in conscious effort, in the cultivation of virtue through study and practice. The other believed in flowing with nature and doing nothing that went against the grain of reality, and allowing things to unfold according to their own nature. Neither man convinced the other. That wasn't really the point. What mattered was that they'd encountered a genuinely different way of thinking. The younger philosopher would go on to develop his system further, and it would profoundly influence Chinese civilization for millennia. But he would also carry with him the memory of this conversation. He would remember the old archivist who suggested that perhaps all his striving was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. As for Laozi, this encounter crystallized something that had been forming in his mind. He realized that his perspective wasn't just a personal preference. It was a genuine alternative to the dominant way of thinking. It offered a different answer to the question of how to live. And perhaps he thought it was time to articulate this perspective more fully. Perhaps it was time to write it down, to preserve it, to offer it to the world. The two men parted as respectfully as they'd met. They didn't become close friends. Their philosophies were too different for that. But they'd touched something important in each other. They'd each recognized that the other was genuinely seeking truth, even if they disagreed about what that truth was. And in a world full of people who were certain they already had all the answers, that recognition mattered. Years passed after that encounter. The kingdom continued its slow dissolution. Regional warlords grew increasingly powerful. The central government became less relevant with each passing season. The capital, once the heart of civilization, now felt like a place caught between two worlds. The old order was dying, but nothing stable had yet emerged to replace it. It was a time of uncertainty, of anxiety, of people grasping for solutions that never quite materialized. Laozi remained in the archive. He continued his work organizing records, answering questions, living quietly in the margins of power. But internally, he'd undergone a transformation. He'd come to see clearly what most people refused to acknowledge. All the striving, all the effort, all the attempts to fix things through force and will, or none of it was working. In fact, it was making everything worse. The more the government tried to maintain control, the more it lost control. The more officials maneuvered for advantage, the more chaos they created. The system was eating itself alive. One morning he made a decision. He decided to leave. It wasn't a dramatic decision. He didn't announce it to anyone. He simply began preparing. He gathered a few possessions. He made arrangements for his position to be transferred to someone else. He said quiet goodbyes to the few people he'd worked closely with over the years. Then when everything was ready, he departed the capital on horseback heading westward. The historical records are vague about his exact motivations. Some accounts suggest he left because he was disgusted with the political situation. Others indicate he simply felt called to withdraw from society to seek a different kind of life. The truth probably contained elements of both. He'd spent enough time observing human nature to understand that you can't fix people who don't want to be fixed. You can't restore order to a system that's fundamentally committed to disorder. Sometimes the only wise choice is to step back and let things unfold as they will. This act of leaving this withdrawal from the center of power embodied a principle that would become central to his philosophy. It was an act of non-action in the sense that he wasn't trying to force change. He wasn't staging a dramatic protest. He wasn't writing manifestos or gathering followers or trying to convince anyone of anything. He simply recognized that his presence in the capital served no purpose anymore, and he left. It was that simple. It was that profound. The journey itself was long. He traveled through territories that were becoming increasingly unstable. Warlords controlled different regions. Bandits roamed the roads. The infrastructure that had once connected the empire was crumbling. Yet he traveled without fear, without urgency, without the desperate energy that characterized most travelers of that era. He moved at his own pace, stopping when he needed to, continuing when he was ready. He didn't fight against the conditions he encountered. He simply adapted to them. Think about what this means. Here was a man who'd spent his entire life in the center of civilization, surrounded by books and scholars and the machinery of government. He'd held a respected position. He'd had security and status and access to knowledge. And he walked away from all of it. Not in anger, not in despair, but in clarity. He understood something that most people never grasp, that the things we cling to, the positions we fight for, the status we accumulate, none of it actually brings peace. In fact, it prevents peace. As he traveled westward, he left behind everything that represented conventional success. The archive with all its accumulated knowledge, the capital with all its power and prestige, the network of scholars and officials who'd known his name. He stripped away all of these things, not because they were bad in themselves, but because he recognized that they weren't essential. They weren't the core of who he was. And by letting them go, he became freer than he'd ever been. The symbolic meaning of this journey cannot be overstated. In the geography of ancient China, the West represented the frontier, the unknown, the place where civilization gave way to wilderness. By heading west, he was literally moving away from the center of power and toward the margins. He was choosing obscurity over prominence. He was choosing simplicity over complexity. He was choosing to follow the natural flow of his own life rather than trying to maintain a position that no longer served him. Different accounts describe different routes and different destinations. Some say he traveled to the Hangu Pass. Others suggest he went all the way to the western regions, beyond the empire's borders. The exact details matter less than the fundamental gesture. He left. He let go. He allowed his life to flow in a new direction without resistance. This wasn't escapism, though it might look that way to someone who doesn't understand. He wasn't running away from problems. He was simply recognizing that some situations can't be solved from within. Sometimes the only wise response to chaos is to step outside of it. Sometimes the only way to maintain your integrity is to remove yourself from a system that demands you compromise it. As he traveled, he had time to think. Time to reflect on everything he'd learned from the archive, from his encounters with other philosophers, from his years of observation. The ideas that had been forming in his mind began to crystallize. He started to see the outlines of a complete philosophy, not a system of rules like the one his younger contemporary was developing, but something more organic, something that flowed like water, something that could be written down, preserved, and offered to future generations. He knew that eventually he would need to record these thoughts. But not yet. First, he needed to complete the journey. First, he needed to fully embody what he was coming to understand. The act of leaving the capital, of traveling westward, of letting go of everything he'd known, this was itself a teaching. This was the philosophy in action. After months of travel, he reached the Hangu Pass. This was the western frontier of the empire, the place where civilization officially ended and the wilderness began. A fortified gate stood here, marking the boundary. Guards were stationed to monitor who entered and who left the kingdom. It was a liminal space, neither fully inside nor fully outside, a threshold between two worlds. The gatekeeper's name was Yin Shu. According to historical records, he was an official of some standing responsible for maintaining the pass and recording those who crossed it. But he was also something more than that. He was a man of learning, someone who studied the mysteries of nature and the principles underlying existence. He understood that knowledge came in different forms, and that the most important truths often couldn't be found in official documents or government records. When the old traveler arrived at the gate, something passed between them immediately. The gatekeeper recognized that this wasn't an ordinary visitor. There was something about the way the man carried himself, something in his bearing that suggested he'd seen deeply into the nature of things. The gatekeeper had spent years at this post watching people come and go, and he'd developed an intuition for recognizing genuine wisdom when he encountered it. He invited the traveler to rest before continuing his journey. This was more than simple hospitality. It was an acknowledgement of something unspoken between them. The traveler accepted the invitation, and they began to talk. Their conversations ranged across many topics. The gatekeeper asked questions about the nature of the Tao, about how to live in harmony with the fundamental principles of existence, about the relationship between action and non-action. The traveler responded not with lectures, but with observations drawn from his long life of watching human nature and the patterns of history. He spoke about water and its qualities. He spoke about the uncarved block and the value of simplicity. He spoke about how the greatest strength often appears as weakness, and how true power manifests as gentleness. The gatekeeper listened intently. He felt something stirring within him, a recognition that he was in the presence of someone who truly understood. But he also felt a kind of urgency. He knew that the traveler wouldn't stay long. He knew that this man was moving westward beyond the boundaries of the empire, perhaps never to return. And he realized that if this wisdom wasn't preserved, if it wasn't written down and recorded, it might be lost forever. So he made a request. He asked the traveler to write down his teachings. He asked him to commit to paper the insights he'd gained from a lifetime of observation and reflection. The traveler initially resisted. Writing things down seemed contrary to what he'd come to understand. The Tao that could be named wasn't the eternal Tao. Truth that could be captured in words was already diminished, already limited. How could you write about something that transcended language? But the gatekeeper persisted gently. He didn't argue forcefully. He simply suggested that while the deepest truth couldn't be fully captured in words, words could still point toward it. They could serve as fingers pointing at the moon. They could guide others toward their own understanding. And more practically, without some record, these insights would disappear with the traveler's death. Wouldn't it be valuable to preserve them for future generations who might benefit from them? The traveler considered this. He thought, perhaps there is wisdom in recording these thoughts. Not because the words themselves contain the truth, but because they might help others recognize the truth within themselves. Perhaps this too is part of the Tao. Perhaps this is how I'm meant to serve. He agreed to write. The gatekeeper provided him with materials, bamboo strips, ink brushes, the tools of the scribe's trade. And over the following days, the traveler wrote. He composed what would become known as the Tao Te Ching, a text of 81 brief verses that would eventually influence countless millions of people across centuries and continents. The process of writing was itself a kind of meditation. As he composed each verse, he wasn't trying to create a logical system or a comprehensive philosophy. He was attempting to capture glimpses of truth to offer poetic expressions of principles that couldn't be fully explained. The verses were deliberately paradoxical, deliberately cryptic. They were meant to provoke thought rather than provide answers. They were meant to point toward understanding rather than deliver it complete. The gatekeeper watched this process unfold. He saw how the traveler would pause between verses, staring into space, waiting for the next insight to emerge. He noticed how the old man's hand moved across the bamboo strips with a kind of natural grace, not forcing the words, but allowing them to flow. It was as if the traveler wasn't really creating the text so much as transcribing something that already existed, something he was simply channeling onto the page. When the writing was complete, the traveler prepared to continue his journey. He handed the completed manuscript to the gatekeeper. This act carried profound significance. By recording his teachings and entrusting them to another person, he was letting go of them. He was releasing them into the world, allowing them to take on a life of their own, to be interpreted and reinterpreted by countless readers across time. He couldn't control how people would understand these words. He couldn't ensure they'd be understood correctly. He could only offer them and trust that those who needed to find them would find them. The gatekeeper received the manuscript with reverence. He understood the gift he'd been given. But he also understood something else. He knew that the true teaching wasn't contained in the words themselves. The true teaching was in the act of the traveler's departure. It was in his willingness to let go. It was in his refusal to cling to his own wisdom or to demand recognition for his insights. The traveler was embodying the very principles he'd written about. Before leaving, the traveler offered one final thought to the gatekeeper. He suggested that the most important thing wasn't to memorize the text or to study it obsessively. The most important thing was to live it, to observe one's own life and see if the principles described in these verses aligned with what one actually experienced, to test the teachings against reality, to allow them to transform one's understanding gradually, naturally, without force. Then he mounted his horse and continued westward beyond the pass, beyond the boundaries of the empire, into the unknown territories that lay beyond. The gatekeeper watched him go, holding the manuscript carefully, understanding that he'd just witnessed something remarkable. He'd encountered a man who'd achieved what most people only dreamed of. He'd met someone who'd truly let go. Now I want to walk you through some of the core teachings that emerged from that manuscript. Not all 81 verses, of course. That would take far too long. But the fundamental principles that run through them like a river, running through a landscape. These are the ideas that would eventually reshape how millions of people understood the world. The first concept we need to understand is Wu Wei. This phrase gets translated different ways in English. Non-action is the most common translation, but it's also misleading. It doesn't mean doing nothing, sitting passively while life happens around you. That would be laziness, not wisdom. Wu Wei means acting without forcing. It means moving in harmony with the natural flow of things rather than against it. It means recognizing when to act and when to refrain from acting based on what the situation actually requires rather than what your ego wants. Think of it like swimming. If you're swimming downstream, you don't need to thrash about frantically. You can move with the current using minimal effort to guide yourself where you want to go. But if you try to swim upstream, you'll exhaust yourself no matter how hard you work. The water will always win. Wu Wei is recognizing which direction you're swimming and adjusting accordingly. The traveler used many examples to illustrate this principle. He spoke about clay. A clay pot is useful precisely because of the empty space inside it. The clay itself is just the container. What matters is the emptiness, the void, the space that allows the pot to hold things. Similarly, a room is useful because of the empty space, not because of the walls. The usefulness comes from what isn't there, not from what is. This seems paradoxical until you really think about it. Then it becomes obvious. He also spoke extensively about water. Water is the softest substance in nature. It has no shape of its own. It conforms to whatever container holds it. Yet water can wear away the hardest stone. It overcomes through yielding rather than through force. It nourishes everything it touches without demanding anything in return. Water never struggles against obstacles. It simply flows around them. and yet nothing in nature is more powerful than water. This contradiction contains a profound truth about how real power actually works. The concept of yin and yang appears throughout the text, though not always explicitly. The traveler understood that reality contains complementary opposites that depend on each other for their existence and meaning. Light requires darkness to be visible. Sound requires silence to be heard. Fullness requires emptiness to have value. Male requires female. Activity requires rest. These opposites aren't in conflict. They're in dance with each other, constantly balancing, constantly flowing between states. Most people, the traveler suggested, make the mistake of trying to maximize one side of this balance while minimizing the other. They want to be constantly active, constantly productive, constantly achieving. They want light without darkness, sound without silence, fullness without emptiness. But this creates imbalance. It creates exhaustion. It creates the very problems people are trying to solve. True wisdom comes from understanding that both sides of the balance are necessary. You need activity and rest. You need fullness and emptiness. You need to push forward sometimes and to yield other times. The traveler wrote about simplicity as a path to understanding. He suggested that people accumulate possessions, accumulate knowledge, accumulate status, thinking that more is always better. But this accumulation actually obscures truth. It creates complexity where simplicity would serve better. He spoke of returning to the uncarved block, to a state of original simplicity. Not the simplicity of ignorance, but the simplicity that comes from understanding what's truly essential and releasing everything else. This doesn't mean you have to live in poverty or reject all knowledge. It means examining your life carefully and asking, do I actually need this? Does this serve my well-being or does it just create more problems? Most people, he suggested, would find that they could release far more than they think. They could live with less and actually be happier. They could know less and actually understand more. The burden of excess, whether material or mental, prevents us from seeing clearly. He also taught about the relationship between names and reality. He wrote that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. This is perhaps his most famous statement, and it's crucial to understanding everything else. What he meant is that reality itself is beyond language. Language is a tool we use to navigate reality, but it's not reality itself. When we name something, we're already limiting it, already imposing our conceptual framework onto it. The deepest truth can't be captured in words because words are inherently limited. This creates a paradox, of course. Here's a man writing down teachings about something that can't be written down. But that's precisely the point. The text isn't meant to be the final authority. It's meant to be a finger pointing at the moon. You're supposed to look where it's pointing, not stare at the finger. The verses are meant to provoke thought, to shake loose your assumptions, to help you see beyond language, to the reality beneath it. The traveler also addressed the question of virtue. He suggested that when people constantly talk about virtue, when they create systems to enforce virtue, it usually means that genuine virtue has already disappeared. True virtue doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply acts in accordance with what's right, without self-consciousness, without expectation of reward. The moment you're aware of your own virtue, the moment you're proud of it, or trying to display it, you've already lost it. He wrote about the sage, the person who truly understands the Tao. This person doesn't try to be wise. They don't accumulate knowledge or seek recognition. They simply observe carefully, respond appropriately to circumstances, and remain humble about what they don't know. The sage is like a mirror reflecting reality without distortion. They don't impose their will on situations. They allow situations to unfold naturally while playing their appropriate role. Throughout all these teachings runs a consistent thread. The thread is this: the harder you try to force outcomes, the more resistance you encounter. The more you cling to things, the more suffering you experience. The more you try to control your life, the less control you actually have. But when you relax your grip, when you stop fighting against reality, when you align yourself with the natural flow of things, everything becomes easier. Not because you're doing nothing, but because you're doing only what's necessary in harmony with circumstances rather than against them. These weren't new ideas entirely. Other traditions had touched on similar principles, but the traveler articulated them with a clarity and completeness that was revolutionary. He wasn't creating a religion or a system of rules. He was describing how reality actually works, how life actually flows when you stop interfering with it. And he was suggesting that peace, true peace, comes not from achieving more or becoming more, but from understanding what you already are and releasing what you don't need. If you'd been living in ancient China during the time the traveler was writing, you would have encountered a very different understanding of power than what he was proposing. The dominant philosophy, the one gaining influence through the younger scholar we met earlier, taught that power came through proper conduct, through mastery of ritual, through the accumulation of knowledge and virtue. Power meant being strong, being decisive, being able to impose your will on others. Power meant rising to the top, accumulating resources, commanding respect through your accomplishments. The traveler's teachings directly contradicted this. In fact, they inverted it completely. He suggested that real power manifests as weakness. True strength appears as gentleness. Genuine authority requires no force. The person who needs to constantly assert their power has already lost it. The ruler who must demand obedience through threats and punishment is fundamentally weak. Real power is so complete that it doesn't need to announce itself. Consider what this means practically. A tyrant who rules through fear must constantly maintain surveillance, constantly punish dissent, constantly worry about rebellion. His power is fragile because it depends on force. The moment he relaxes his grip, people will resist. But a leader who rules through genuine wisdom, who makes decisions that actually benefit people, who earns respect rather than demanding it, that leader doesn't need to worry. People will follow naturally because they want to and not because they're forced to. The traveler illustrated this with the image of the valley. A valley is low. It's beneath the mountains. It seems weak and insignificant. Yet water flows toward the valley. The valley receives everything. It's the most powerful position precisely because it's the lowest. It doesn't fight for dominance. It simply receives what comes to it. And by receiving it becomes full. This principle applies to individuals as well as to rulers. The person who's constantly trying to prove themselves, constantly seeking recognition, constantly competing with others, that person is exhausting themselves. They're always on edge, always defensive, always worried about losing their position. But the person who's content with their place, who doesn't need to prove anything, who's secure in themselves, that person has real power. They can afford to be generous because they're not afraid of losing what they have. They can afford to be humble because they don't need to inflate their ego. They can afford to listen to others because they're not threatened by different perspectives. The traveler wrote about this in relation to ambition. He suggested that the person who's most driven to achieve success is often the least likely to achieve it in any meaningful way. Why? Because their constant striving creates resistance. Their desperation repels people. Their need to win alienates potential allies. They're always pushing, always fighting, always struggling, and all that struggle creates exactly the opposite of what they want. Meanwhile, the person who's released their attachment to success, who's simply doing their work well without obsessing over outcomes, often finds that success comes naturally, not because they're trying to achieve it, but because they're not blocking it. This seems backwards to most people. It seems like laziness or resignation, but it's actually the opposite. It requires tremendous discipline to release your attachment to outcomes. It requires genuine confidence to stop trying to control everything. It requires real wisdom to know when to push and when to yield. The traveler wasn't advocating for passivity. He was advocating for intelligent action. Action that's proportionate to circumstances. Action that flows with reality rather than against it. He also addressed the question of accumulation. In his time as in ours, people believed that more was always better. More money, more possessions, more status, more knowledge. The traveler suggested that this belief was fundamentally mistaken. Accumulation creates problems. The more you have, the more you have to protect. The more you have, the more you have to worry about losing. The more you have, the more complicated your life becomes. And the irony is that none of it actually makes you happier. People with enormous wealth often find themselves more anxious than people with modest means. They have more to lose. He wrote about this using the image of a cup. A cup is useful when it's empty. When it's full, it can't receive anything new. Similarly, a mind that's full of fixed ideas can't learn anything new. A life that's packed with possessions and commitments can't accommodate anything unexpected. But a life that's relatively simple, a mind that remains open and empty, can receive whatever comes. It can adapt. It can grow. It can respond creatively to circumstances. This directly challenged the conventional wisdom of his time. Scholars were accumulating vast libraries of knowledge. Officials were accumulating power and position. Merchants were accumulating wealth. Everyone was trying to fill themselves up to become more, to have more. The traveler suggested that this entire approach was backwards. He suggested that the path to genuine power and fulfillment came through releasing, through simplifying, through emptying yourself of unnecessary attachments. He also wrote about the relationship between strength and flexibility. A tree that's rigid and brittle will snap in a strong wind, but a tree that's flexible, that can bend and sway, will survive. A person who's rigid in their thinking, who refuses to adapt, who insists on their way being the only way, that person will break when circumstances change. But a person who's flexible, who can adjust their approach based on what's needed, who can yield without losing their center, that person survives and thrives. This principle extended to governance as well. The traveler suggested that the best ruler is one who does very little, not because the ruler is lazy, but because the ruler understands that the less you interfere with natural processes, the better things work. When a ruler tries to control everything, when they create elaborate systems and regulations, they inevitably create problems. But when a ruler establishes basic principles and then allows people to govern themselves within those principles, things tend to work well. People are naturally inclined toward cooperation and mutual benefit. They don't need constant supervision and control. In fact, constant supervision and control prevents the natural cooperation that would otherwise emerge. The traveler knew that this teaching would be controversial. He knew that powerful people wouldn't want to hear that their power was actually weakness. He knew that ambitious people wouldn't want to hear that their ambition was preventing them from achieving their goals. But he also knew that this truth needed to be preserved. Future generations would need to hear it. and some of them at least would recognize its validity. Some would see that their own experience confirmed what he was teaching. The paradox of power, then, is this: the person who seeks power loses it. The person who releases the need for power gains it. The person who tries to control everything controls nothing. The person who accepts what they can't control often finds themselves able to influence far more than they imagined. This isn't mystical. It's simply how reality works when you stop fighting against it. There's an image that appears repeatedly in the traveler's writings, and it's one of the most important concepts to understand if you want to grasp what he's really teaching. It's the image of the uncarved block. In Chinese, it's called pu, and it represents something profound about the nature of existence and human potential. Imagine a piece of wood in its natural state. It hasn't been shaped or carved or refined into anything specific. It has no particular form. It has no particular purpose. It's just wood. But this uncarved block contains infinite potential. You could carve it into a bowl, a cup, a tool, a sculpture, 1,000 different things. The potential exists in its undifferentiated state. The moment you carve it, you've limited it. You've made it into one specific thing, which means it can no longer be all the other things it could have been. The traveler suggested that human beings are like this. We're born as uncarved blocks full of potential, naturally responsive to our environment, without fixed ideas or rigid patterns. But then society gets to work. We're educated. We're trained. We're shaped according to social expectations. We're carved. And with each carving, we lose potential. We become more defined, more limited, more rigid. We become excellent at being one particular thing, but we lose the flexibility to be other things. This isn't to say that education and development are bad. They're necessary. You need some carving to function in society. But the traveler's point is that we carve too much. We carve too early. We carve too aggressively. We take children who are naturally curious, naturally creative, naturally responsive to the world, and we shape them into narrow versions of themselves. We teach them what to think instead of how to think. We teach them to fit in instead of to be themselves. We carve away their potential in the name of making them productive members of society. The path back to the uncarved block, then, is about recovering some of that original simplicity. Not by becoming ignorant or uneducated, but by releasing the unnecessary carvings. By letting go of the rigid patterns we've developed. By returning to a state of openness and responsiveness. By becoming, in a sense, simple again. The traveler illustrated this with the image of a newborn child. A newborn doesn't know anything. It has no fixed ideas about how the world works. It responds directly to what it experiences. It cries when it's hungry, sleeps when it's tired, laughs when it's delighted. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. It doesn't worry about what others think of it. It doesn't try to impress anyone. It's completely authentic because it hasn't yet learned to be anything else. Now, obviously, you can't go back to being a newborn. You can't unlearn everything you've learned, and you shouldn't try. The point isn't regression. The point is to recover some of that quality while retaining the knowledge and skills you've developed. It's to become simple again without becoming ignorant. It's to become authentic again without becoming irresponsible. This recovery of simplicity involves several things. First, it involves examining your life and asking what's actually necessary. Most of us accumulate things, possessions, commitments, relationships, ideas without regularly questioning whether we still need them. We keep doing things because we've always done them. We keep believing things because we've always believed them. We keep maintaining relationships that no longer serve us. The traveler suggested that genuine simplicity requires regular pruning. You need to look at your life and ask, do I still need this? Does this still serve me, or am I just carrying it out of habit? When you actually do this examination, you'll probably find that you can release far more than you think. You can release possessions you haven't used in years. You can release commitments that no longer align with your values. You can release beliefs that you've outgrown. You can release relationships that drain your energy. And with each thing you release, you become lighter. You become freer. You become more responsive to what's actually happening in your life, rather than being weighed down by what you're carrying from the past. The traveler also spoke about returning to the source in terms of your fundamental nature. He suggested that beneath all the conditioning, beneath all the roles you play, beneath all the masks you wear, there's a core self that's simple and true. This core self doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't need to impress anyone. It doesn't need to be anything other than what it is. Most of us spend our entire lives running away from this core self, trying to be something more impressive, something more successful, something more worthy of love and respect. But the traveler suggested that this running away is the source of our suffering. When you return to your core self, when you accept who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, something shifts. You stop needing external validation. You stop trying to be someone you're not. You stop performing for an imaginary audience. You become real. And paradoxically, when you become real, when you stop trying to be impressive, people are actually more drawn to you. Authenticity is attractive in a way that performance never is. He also wrote about returning to the source in terms of your relationship with nature. He suggested that humans have become disconnected from the natural world, and this disconnection is a major source of our suffering. We live in artificial environments. We spend our time with artificial concerns. We've forgotten how to simply observe nature, how to learn from it, how to align ourselves with its rhythms. The traveler suggested that spending time in nature, observing how things naturally unfold, watching how water flows and plants grow and seasons change can teach us more about how to live than any amount of intellectual study. When you return to nature, you notice things. You notice that nothing in nature is in a hurry. Trees don't rush to grow. Rivers don't strain to flow. Seasons don't force themselves to change. Everything unfolds in its own time according to its own nature. And yet, everything gets done. Everything that needs to happen happens. The traveler suggested that if we could learn to live more like nature, if we could release our constant rushing and striving, we'd actually accomplish more, while enjoying the process far more. He also spoke about returning to the source in terms of your relationship with others. He suggested that most of our conflicts with other people come from trying to make them into something they're not. We want them to think like us believe, like us behave like us. We judge them for being different. We try to change them. But this creates constant friction. The traveler suggested that if we could accept people as they are, if we could release our need to make them into our image, relationships would become much simpler and more peaceful. You could appreciate people for who they actually are, rather than being frustrated by who they're not. The return to the source then is really about releasing. Releasing unnecessary possessions. Releasing unnecessary commitments. Releasing unnecessary beliefs. Releasing unnecessary judgments. Releasing the need to be impressive. Releasing the need to control others. Releasing the need to prove your worth. With each release, you return a little more to your original simplicity. And in that simplicity, you find peace. Not the peace of numbness or resignation, but the peace of alignment. The peace of being fully yourself, fully present, fully engaged with life as it actually is, rather than as you think it should be. After the traveler disappeared into the Western territories, the manuscript he'd left behind began its own journey. The gatekeeper who'd received it understood its value, and he made copies. These copies spread slowly, at first passed from scholar to scholar, from teacher to student. In those early centuries, the text remained relatively obscure. It competed for attention with a more systematic philosophy of the younger scholar we met earlier, which had become the official ideology of various Chinese dynasties. That philosophy emphasized hierarchy, ritual, and proper conduct. It was easier to teach. It was easier to enforce. It aligned well with the interests of those in power. But something remarkable happened over time. The traveler's teachings didn't disappear. They persisted. They survived periods of suppression. They found new audiences in each generation. By the time several centuries had passed, the text had become recognized as one of the most important philosophical works in Chinese civilization. It influenced not just philosophy, but art, poetry, medicine, martial arts, and the entire way that Chinese culture understood the world. Why did this happen? Why did a text that seemed to contradict conventional wisdom, that offered no clear path to power or success, that suggested that striving was counterproductive, why did this text endure while countless other philosophical works faded away? The answer, I think, is that people kept recognizing its truth. Each generation of readers encountered it and found that it resonated with their actual experience of life. They found that the principles described in the text actually worked. When they stopped trying so hard, when they released their attachment to outcomes, when they aligned themselves with the natural flow of circumstances, things actually went better. The influence of the traveler's philosophy on Chinese culture was profound and pervasive. It shaped how Chinese artists approached their work. Painters learned to suggest rather than to depict completely. They learned to leave space on the canvas, understanding that emptiness was as important as fullness. They learned that the most powerful paintings often contained vast areas of empty space that invited the viewer's imagination to complete the picture. This wasn't laziness or incompleteness. It was sophistication. It was understanding that less could be more. Musicians applied the same principle. They learned that silence was as important as sound, that the spaces between notes were as significant as the notes themselves, that a composition that left room for interpretation, that didn't spell everything out explicitly, could be far more moving than one that tried to be complete and explicit. The most beautiful music often contains moments of silence that allow the listener to integrate what they've heard, to feel the resonance of what came before. Martial artists incorporated these principles into their practice. They learned that the most effective martial techniques often involved using an opponent's own force against them rather than meeting force with force. They learned that yielding could be more effective than resisting, that flexibility could overcome rigidity, that the softest approach could defeat the hardest resistance. These principles, drawn directly from the traveler's teachings, became fundamental to martial arts traditions that would eventually spread throughout the world. Medical practitioners also applied these ideas. They learned to work with the body's natural healing processes rather than against them. They learned that sometimes the best medicine was to remove obstacles to health rather than to force health through aggressive intervention. They developed systems of diagnosis and treatment that emphasized balance, that understood illness as a disruption of harmony that needed to be restored rather than as an enemy to be conquered. This approach to medicine, rooted in Taoist principles, influenced Chinese medical practice for thousands of years. But perhaps most importantly, the traveler's philosophy influenced how ordinary people lived their lives. It offered an alternative to the constant striving that characterized so much of human existence. It suggested that peace was available not through achievement, but through acceptance. Not through accumulation, but through release. Not through force, but through yielding. For people exhausted by the demands of society, by the constant pressure to achieve more and be more, this philosophy offered relief. It offered permission to stop struggling. It offered a path to peace that didn't require you to become someone different or to accomplish something extraordinary. Over the centuries, the text became intertwined with religious Taoism. While the traveler's original teachings were philosophical rather than religious, they eventually became incorporated into a religious tradition that included rituals, deities, and spiritual practices. Some scholars argue that this religious development diluted the original philosophical insights. Others suggest that it was a natural evolution, that the principles were so powerful that they naturally attracted spiritual seekers who wanted to deepen their practice. Either way, the core insights persisted. They survived the transformation from philosophy to religion. They survived periods of suppression. They survived changing dynasties and cultural shifts. When the traveler's teachings eventually reached the West centuries after they were first written, they encountered a culture that was, in many ways, the opposite of what they described. Western civilization had built itself on the principles of progress, of constant improvement, of mastering nature and controlling outcomes. The idea that you could achieve peace through non-action, that you could succeed through yielding, that you could find power in weakness, these ideas seemed radical and counterintuitive to Western minds, yet they found an audience here too. In the 20th century, as Western civilization began to experience the consequences of its relentless striving, as people began to feel exhausted by the constant pressure to achieve and accumulate, the traveler's teachings found new relevance. Artists, musicians, and writers incorporated Taoist principles into their work. Psychologists and therapists began to recognize that some of the principles described in the ancient text aligned with what they were discovering about human psychology. The idea of Wu Wei, of acting without forcing, began to appear in discussions of flow states and optimal performance. The principle of balance between activity and rest began to inform new approaches to wellness and mental health. Today, over 2,000 years after the traveler wrote his 81 verses, his influence continues to spread. His teachings appear in the business books about leadership and management. They influence how people approach personal development and self-improvement. They provide a counterbalance to the relentless pressure of modern life that tells us we need to do more, achieve more, be more. In a world that's increasingly complex, increasingly demanding, increasingly exhausting, the traveler's simple message continues to resonate. Sometimes the answer isn't to do more. Sometimes the answer is to do less. Sometimes the answer is to let go. The legacy of the traveler, then, is the legacy of letting go. It's the legacy of suggesting that peace is available to us right now, not as a reward for future achievement, but as something we can access by releasing our attachment to achievement. It's the legacy of teaching that strength can manifest as gentleness, that power can appear as weakness, that the most effective action is often the action that doesn't force. It's the legacy of offering an alternative to the constant striving that characterizes so much of human life. And perhaps most importantly, it's the legacy of suggesting that this alternative actually works. That when you stop fighting against reality, when you align yourself with a natural flow of things, life becomes not just easier, but richer, deeper, more meaningful. Now I want to bring this back to you. Because the traveler's teachings aren't just interesting historical information. They're not just ancient wisdom that's nice to know about. They're meant to be lived. They're meant to transform how you actually experience your life. And that transformation starts with understanding how these principles apply to your specific situation, your specific struggles, your specific journey. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about the areas where you're struggling. Maybe you're struggling with work, feeling like no matter how hard you work, you're never doing enough. Maybe you're struggling with relationships, trying to control how others think or feel about you. Maybe you're struggling with your own sense of self-worth, constantly trying to prove that you're valuable, that you matter, that you deserve to take up space in the world. Whatever your struggle is, I want to suggest that the traveler's teachings might offer a different approach. Let's start with work. Most of us are taught that success comes from effort. The harder you work, the more you'll achieve. And there's truth in that. Effort matters. But there's also a point where more effort stops helping and starts hurting. There's a point where you're working so hard that you're actually creating problems rather than solving them. You're so focused on the outcome that you're not paying attention to the process. You're so desperate to succeed that you're repelling the very success you're chasing. The traveler would suggest a different approach. Instead of constantly pushing, instead of always trying to force outcomes, what if you focused on doing your work well? What if you put your full attention on the task itself rather than on the result? What if you worked with the natural flow of your energy rather than against it? What if you recognized when you're tired and needed rest rather than pushing through exhaustion? What if you trusted that when you do good work, when you're fully present and engaged, the results will follow naturally? This isn't about being lazy. It's about being smart. It's about recognizing that constant pushing creates resistance. It's about understanding that the most creative solutions often come when you're not desperately trying to solve the problem. It's about allowing space for inspiration and insight to emerge. When you stop forcing, when you relax your grip, often the answer you've been searching for suddenly becomes obvious. Consider your relationships. How much energy do you spend trying to control how others perceive you? How much effort goes into managing your image, into being impressive, into trying to make people like you? The traveler would suggest that this effort is counterproductive. The more you try to be impressive, the less genuine you become. The more you try to control how others perceive you, the more anxious you become. You're constantly monitoring their reactions, constantly adjusting your behavior, constantly worried that you're not measuring up. What if you released that need? What if you simply allowed yourself to be who you are without trying to be anyone else? What if you accepted that not everyone will like you, and that's okay? What if you recognize that the people who matter most are the ones who appreciate you for who you actually are, not for who you're trying to be? The irony is that when you stop trying to be impressive, when you become genuinely yourself, people are actually more drawn to you. Authenticity is magnetic in a way that performance never is. This applies to your relationship with yourself as well. How much energy do you spend judging yourself? How much time do you spend thinking about your flaws, your failures, your inadequacies? The traveler would suggest that this self-judgment is a form of resistance. It's you fighting against yourself. It's you refusing to accept who you are. And this refusal creates suffering. What if you could accept yourself as you are right now? Not as a permanent state, not as an excuse to stop growing, but as a starting point. What if you could acknowledge your flaws without being devastated by them? What if you could recognize your failures as part of your learning process, rather than as proof of your inadequacy? What if you could treat yourself with the same compassion you'd offer to a good friend who is struggling? The traveler taught that this kind of self-acceptance is actually the foundation for genuine growth. When you stop fighting against yourself, when you stop trying to be someone different, you have energy available for actual development. You can learn from your mistakes without being crushed by shame. You can work on your weaknesses without being paralyzed by self-judgment. You can grow naturally at your own pace without the constant internal warfare that prevents most people from changing. Think about your daily life. How much of your time and energy goes into things that don't really matter? How many commitments do you maintain out of obligation rather than genuine desire? How many possessions do you keep that you don't actually use or enjoy? How many relationships do you maintain that drain your energy? The traveler would suggest that genuine peace comes from releasing these unnecessary things. This doesn't mean becoming a hermit or rejecting all responsibility. It means being intentional. It means regularly examining your life and asking, does this serve me? Does this align with my values? Do I actually want to do this, or am I just doing it because I've always done it? When you answer honestly, you'll probably find areas where you can simplify. You can release commitments that no longer serve you. You can let go of possessions that are just taking up space. You can step back from relationships that are draining without giving back. Each time you release something unnecessary, you become lighter. You become freer. You have more energy available for the things that actually matter. You have more space in your life for what's truly important. And paradoxically, by doing less, by maintaining fewer commitments, by owning fewer things, you often find that your life becomes richer. The things you do have more of your attention. The relationships you maintain are deeper. The work you do is more meaningful. The traveler also taught about the importance of balance. In your life right now, are you in balance? Are you balancing activity with rest, doing with being, striving with accepting, engaging with the world, with withdrawing to reflect? Most of us are out of balance. We're either constantly active, constantly pushing, constantly doing, or we're withdrawn and passive. The traveler would suggest that genuine well-being comes from finding the middle path, from recognizing when you need to push and when you need to yield, from understanding that both are necessary. Think about your own rhythm. When do you do your best work? When are you most creative? When are you most at peace? For most people, these states emerge not from constant effort, but from a rhythm of engagement and rest. You work intensely for a period, then you rest. You engage deeply, then you withdraw to reflect. You push forward, then you allow things to unfold. This natural rhythm is far more sustainable than constant pushing. Finally, the traveler taught about finding your own Tao, your own path, your own way of being in the world, not the path someone else has prescribed for you, not the path that society expects you to follow, but your own path, the one that aligns with who you actually are. This is perhaps the most important teaching of all, because ultimately, the traveler's philosophy isn't about following rules or adopting a system. It's about discovering your own nature and learning to live in harmony with it. Your Tao is unique to you. It's the path that emerges when you stop trying to be someone else. It's the direction that calls to you when you quiet the noise of external expectations. It's the way of being that feels most authentic, most alive, most true. Finding your Tao requires courage. It requires releasing other people's expectations. It requires trusting yourself. It requires being willing to be different, to go against the grain, to follow a path that others might not understand. But when you find your Tao, when you align your life with your own nature rather than fighting against it, something shifts. Life becomes easier, not because external circumstances change, but because you're no longer creating internal resistance. You're flowing with yourself instead of against yourself. You're doing what comes naturally instead of constantly forcing yourself to be something you're not. And in that alignment, you find peace. Not the peace of numbness or resignation, but the peace of being fully yourself, fully alive, fully engaged with your own life. So here we are at the end of this story. You've traveled with me through the life of a man who lived over 2,000 years ago, who sat in an archive organizing records, who had a conversation that changed his understanding of everything, who walked away from power and security to follow his own path. You've learned about his teachings about water and valleys, about the uncarved block and the power of yielding. You've thought about how these ancient principles might apply to your own life right now, and now it's time to rest. Before you drift into sleep, I want you to hold on to something simple. The traveler's core message wasn't complicated. It was this: you don't have to figure everything out. You don't have to force your life into a particular shape. You don't have to prove your worth or earn your place in the world. You're already enough. Right now, as you are, you're enough. The peace you're seeking isn't somewhere far away. It's not something you have to achieve or earn or become worthy of. It's available to you right now in this moment if you can simply stop struggling against yourself, if you can release the need to be impressive, if you can accept what is rather than constantly fighting for what you think should be. Tomorrow when you wake, you can go back to your life. You can work and strive and pursue your goals. That's fine. That's part of living. But perhaps you can do it differently. Perhaps you can do it with less desperation. Perhaps you can do it while also allowing yourself to rest, to simply exist without constantly trying to become something more. The traveler knew something that most people never discover. He knew that the path to peace runs through acceptance, not through achievement. He knew that the way forward often requires stepping back. He knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Carry that with you, not as a burden, not as another thing you have to do perfectly, but as a gentle reminder, a whisper in the back of your mind that says, it's okay to let go. It's okay to be yourself. It's okay to flow with life instead of constantly fighting it. Now close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. Feel your body becoming heavier, sinking into the bed. Release the day. Release your worries. Release your need to figure everything out right now. Tomorrow will come soon enough. For now, just rest. You've earned it. You're doing the best you can. And that's enough. Sleep well.